Hey, this is Fremzenek Podcast, episode 11, and today I'm joined by Ian Pownell, and I'll just give some background, and then you can introduce yourself. So so we met at a Model UN event that I did for my sixth form, which I did win on it. It's on my website, zenenvolt.com is the image of me dressed up as Trump. I fled as American. I suppose we could get into a conversation about him. So if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. My name is Ian Pownell. I'm a senior lecturer at Lincoln Bishop University. I began my career quite a long time ago now when I got my first degree in physics. So I began life as a physicist, and I've been gradually, I suppose, moving sideways ever since, and currently work in the business school there.
Yeah. So, of course, we met at the Model UN event, so I suppose we more talk about like politics and economics and things. But I'm sure there's a lot, especially with because we scheduled this last Thursday, and since last Thursday, there's been a lot of geopolitical development, and I'm sure we can talk a lot about the business side of that. Because I wanted to get into the especially because of my interest in the economic side, so the predicted inflationary shock that we're going to go through with the oil prices and all of these things. Because literally just today, the Qatar announced that they're shutting down their liquid natural gas plants, so they won't be processed anymore. And of course, a lot of that flows into China, so there's immediately going to be an effect on sort of Chinese profit margins, and you could say maybe they'll start raising prices, which the amount of exports they have will raise prices across the board. And of course, there's just the idea that oil and natural gas and all of these things are sort of essential products in everything nowadays, and that's also going to lead to inflation and other things. So I suppose, what's your 2 cents on that?
Yeah, it's a lot of unknowns, isn't it, right now? I think it probably depends upon how long the current, I'm going to call it the Iran war. It's a question whether it is a war or not, but how long that persists, how many countries are sucked into it, and then all the consequences you talked about regarding not just immediate impact upon energy supplies, but also all the derived demand as well, all the goods that use oil or that rely upon energy for other things to occur. So I think a lot of countries will see, just so we got inflation back under control post-COVID, we'll see spikes coming through for wholesale energy costs. In the short term, petrol, gas, they will also be drive up, and then you get in the longer term, as you're suggesting, there's, the impact upon manufactured goods, which are shipped mainly from China to the rest of the world these days. So I think there are significant consequences in the short, medium, and long term. And it partly depends upon how long this current situation uncertainty persists.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, now that inflation was finally sort of under control after COVID, and we were seeing interest rates finally starting to drop, there's now a question of maybe they're going to have to be risen again to counteract this inflationary shock. And we were already struggling with debt and all of these other things, and especially the US printing all this debt. If they have to raise interest rates, it's going to be hugely consequential for the central government, especially.
Yeah, I think there are some countries. I mean, I don't think the UK is as exposed as other countries. I think one factor that may put a brake on how far and how long the American administration pursues this policy will be upon domestic support for it, which is already very low. But if it starts to hurt the American at the petrol station, at their savings, I saw a chart today that saw the fall in their 401k pension savings was significant. Then that will put pressure upon the Republican Party to find an exit ramp at some point. I think I hold a bit more store in that as being the kind of control mechanism than other countries, international rule of law exerting influence upon Donald Trump and the administration. So that's why I would see more shifts perhaps coming in the next couple of weeks if the American people start to get a bit uncomfortable and they start to feel a pinch of this.
Yeah. I mean, we saw Trump not just too long ago saying how affordability is a myth and all these things. So it's questionable if he's gonna put his fingers in his ears and scream and just ignore everyone, because of that. I mean, I could very much see that being a possibility. Hopefully, that doesn't happen, and he does obviously take on the public outcry on board and stop soon. Of course, Israel was the one who first instigated it, I believe. So, and they've already had huge public outcry over their Gaza war crimes, and now with them trying to fight with Lebanon and all these other things, it's
Yeah.
yeah, I'm surprised they've been able to continue the public, not because there isn't really much public support really. It's just sort of a small
No,
subgroup.
not for this situation, not for the Gaza war. Once it got past a point at which, once it got past a point of simply a nation state defending its citizens, and became much more of a kind of pursuit of certain individuals and groups. But don't forget, the Americans have got the midterms coming up, which I think the way that will play out, I think will be quite interesting in America now. And then Netanyahu has the elections coming up later in the year, and he'll be want to be seen, I think, as a bit of a strong man, securing a Jewish identity and a Jewish state and so forth. And they are, as you know, the history behind all of these issues is complicated, it's lengthy, and it's deep. But I'm not an expert in the area. I just try and take a more holistic view of some of the ways in which this could play out, and the different scenarios that could be developed. I'm sure that the Americans have got. I'd be extremely surprised if they've not had any kind of scenario or forecasting or foresight activity to anticipate different ways in which this could develop, the Iran war, as it currently is being labelled. Obviously, they would not disclose that in a public forum. It's obviously very sensitive information. But I don't think we are there as blind as the media is trying to portray them as having no plan. I think there is probably a plan, but it's maybe one that they don't wish to share at this point.
Yeah, I saw a statistic today. It was that since the attacks on Iran since Saturday, that America has used more mid and long range missiles than Ukraine has in its entire 4 years. So I thought that was shocking. It really just, they were really pretending to support Ukraine and just doing enough to toe the line. When they really needed to put their might forward, they very clearly were giving Ukraine quite a raw deal. And that's,
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that this is objectively a hostile war on Iran and they're using this many missiles, but when it comes to defending, and not a NATO ally, but certainly a NATO adjacent ally, they really did not.
I saw a somewhat parallel argument as well in the press about the asymmetrical costs involved in these relationships. So you're shooting down drones with multi-million-dollar, well, even the air-to-air missiles, like the Patriots, they're $1 to $3 million each, but a drone costs 20,000 or so forth. So there's a cost. As naked as it sounds, there's a cost to the battles and to the wars and the ammunition that's being thrown at this, and that's going to be a burden upon the Americans and the Israelis when they're fighting an enemy which is basically, using much cheaper ammunition to absorb some of these vast amounts of expensive equipment the Americans have got, which is very advanced, very technical, and very good at what it does, but it's not cheap. It's very expensive. And the American people are paying for this through their taxes.
Well, up until this point, they were all used for precision strikes, and now they're sort of being used for bombardment, and it's very, very clearly not advice, but if you were to imagine them to pitch one way, America would most likely take the Russian route and start turning to numbers and quantity, which again, with their much larger population, they could support, but it's certainly not the route you'd want to see in the event of an attritional war.
At that same time, I was reading that further on, it talked about the Ukrainians had become quite good at shooting down drones with rifles and manual weapons from back of jeeps. I think they probably can teach the Americans maybe one or two things about how to approach this process,
Mm.
albeit that I think the Ukrainian battlefronts are in much more rural environments, unlike the Middle East, which is very urbanized. And there are lots and lots of vested interests from different nationalities to consider. So I think it's potentially a much more challenging engagement than the Ukraine-Russian front, which, whilst it's awful and bloody, is taking place in across a much larger front and a much more rural environment. And
Yeah. So when we were talking, you mentioned the American midterms, and on that, of course, Trump has it's fairly recent news, not entirely recent, but he said he wanted to federalize the election process. So I'd be wondering what your views on that are and how that could develop potentially, if you're familiar.
I've heard the argument. I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that term, though. I'm assuming it means some sort of centralized control over the process.
Because
But
it's state level currently, I believe.
yes, it is.
Hmm.
And there may be arguments about honesty and authenticity of the process, and I'm not particularly privy, but it does clearly have an issue regarding what he believes to be the veracity of the electioneering process in America. Um, it's very difficult to, I think, try to see what he means by that. I mean, he says a lot of comments. I mean, I was just before we came online, I was reading through a thread where someone had asked Grok, Elon Musk's AI engine, how many untruths President Trump had told in his first term, and it was the number came back as 30,000. Which, when you think about it, is remarkable. And the leader of the most powerful economic and military country in the world is able to articulate in that way. And there's very little checks and balances in the American process and system. So it's a little bit concerning that if a UK politician, for example, if a UK politician was called out on a lie or a misinformation or a mistruth, probably it would cost them their job. They may come back in a few years' time, bit of a revolving door in UK politics, but doesn't seem to be the situation in the American environment, American press. It's very much more leaning towards perhaps currently more authoritarian stance on many issues, even though it's the democratically elected process. So it's just kind of threads I have in terms of what this may mean, how it may work, and same as the bluster regarding when Trump talks about going for a third term, which would require, constitutional change to allow that to happen. And it may just be bluster. I mean, he's very well known for saying things deliberately to create uncertainty and to offset his opponents to enable deals to be done in his transactional approach. So I don't know whether it's that narrative or whether it's just I'm keeping an eye upon the election process because I believe there are issues there, or whether he's actually quite clear in what he would like to do to centralize and take it away from the states to control. I think time will tell on that issue, perhaps.
Oh, I feel like with his heavy influence in ICE and the likes, the fact that people,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying people do, but the fact that you'd imagine some people are in support of federalizing elections and centralizing that control when we've seen the state or the federal state taking much more sort of liberties against its own citizens compared to actual states. And also,
when you go back to when he began his term and he had Elon Musk in charge of the Doge office, and yet this same statement about centralizing would require more federal staff to do that function, taken away from the state staff. That would increase the federal budget to live upon this, and becomes again, is that really efficient in terms of what Doge was set up to do as well? So again, inconsistencies perhaps in the policy and practice.
Well, excluding tariffs, the federal deficit is the highest it's ever been.
Yes,
and that's assuming, of course, the tariffs hold. That's another thing because they were deemed illegal.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, again, I saw the narrative about companies putting cases and suits together to claim back the penalties they've had to pay. That could be a very, very long legal battle in America, and I don't see it going anywhere near completion for the next, 4 to 5, 6, maybe 10 years.
Mm,
It'll get bogged down, and then things will rumble on and change, and new presidents will come and go in that interim, I'm sure.
mm. And so going back to I had this thought going back to the stem you were talking about people in America, of course, lying and all these things. And of course, Pam Bondi lied under oath and was not prosecuted at all. Yeah, so of course she said that Trump had no, um, I believe felony charges, and of course he does. He is 33, I believe, and she was under oath when she said
Yeah.
that. So she lied under oath, and we saw absolutely no prosecution from that. And that's almost a wake up moment for me. Right, it's crazy the degradation of institutions. Because I mean, under the UK, you lied under oath, you'd be serving prison time potentially, and she just got away with it.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the nature of the difference between a presidential system and a prime ministerial system. Um, I'm not an expert in American political systems or how it really fundamentally works, but at the end of the day, it does give the president significant executive authority without recourse to any form of parliamentary or congressional approval. And I think Trump's been much more clever this time round than when he had his first term, when he seemed to be a little bit unsure of how to set his administration up. And some of the staff he appointed, I think, were not necessarily fully on board with his vision for what he wanted to do. Whereas this time, I think he hit the ground running really hard and really fast, having learned from the first administration he had as to what he wanted to do, how he wanted to the tariff issue, the laws you want to call back upon, even though the Supreme Court's overturned that, there are still viable pieces of legislation he can use to leverage tariffs across anybody in the world that he deems he wishes to do so, as he just threatened to do with Spain the other day, because Spain wouldn't allow him to, didn't support him in the Iran war and give any material provision for that. So I do think he's been a lot more savvy this time around than his first term, where I think he was much more learning the ropes of being in political office, and now he's learned them and he's maximizing the potential influence he can have. And that goes back to your point about Pam Bondi. I think the people he's appointed have more or less been very much cast in the same mold and pursuit of the same, making America great again movement. And I think people know that if anyone comes after Pam Bondi or anybody else, that the administration will be very vindictive towards that individual. All the organizations. I mean, corporate America, I think, is also playing it very softly with him for fear of retribution or fear of access or punitive damages or getting locked up into libel cases for God knows how many years.
Mm. And of course, there was also Project 2025. That's certainly, I mean, of course, Trump had his own Bible, but that is almost the real Trump Bible. He swears by it. There's that website, Project 2025 Tracker, and it's almost over 50% of the goals laid out in Project 2025 have already been passed by Trump. And so the fact that he ran in the election saying, "Oh, I would never pursue that. I would never pursue that," and he's about 50% there already. It's insane levels of hypocrisy.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I got family members who very much are Trump supporters, and their view of him is he's a very strong man. He does what he says he would do, doesn't suffer fools, and for many people, that's the very definition of a leader. So I think for many people, he fulfills that caricature, if you like, of that function and role. And that's certainly carried weight with many electors, voters in America, particularly those that were in the deindustrialized heartlands. So I understand entirely, I think, how his support generated his power base. But I think you're also right that the way this is developing, and so even some of his diehards are not convinced that there should be another war of perhaps unclear end at this point. with unclear consequences.
Mm. Well,
So I think that there's some divergence there.
he ran as the president of peace, of course.
He did, yes, yes. And the
So,
border peace just preceded this as well,
mm,
and its creation. So there's certainly some dichotomies there.
yeah, and they, I believe it was very recent. They stopped the presidential approval tracking. There was that company that had been doing it since the 1930s, and they stopped. But that was certainly because his approval ratings were almost a linear graph down. It was
Yeah, yeah. But
had some
no.
bumps.
But he's made I've seen some comments. You've seen the same thing about he doesn't you know, he as long as he's pleased he's doing the right thing, approval ratings aren't important to him. And they probably aren't right now. He's just a year into office. He's probably got another maybe 8 to 10 months or perhaps unfettered power and control before he might lose some influence at the midterm. So I don't think he's overly bothered now. It depends how this plays out, I think, over the next 6 to 8 months and the consequences of this.
Mm. And I suppose on the topic of elections was very recently the Gorton and Denton by-election. With I'll lay out my biases right now. I am a member of the Green Party, so I'm quite happy with the news. And but I must admit, I would say the Greens. I didn't see any bad press about the Greens, but both Reform and Labour had some scandals in the by-election. Of course, was the Reform letter, which was not marked as political messaging, which was supposedly a printing error. And I'm inclined not to believe that because it has happened before with Reform, but that it was ruled as a mistake. So I suppose it probably was then. And of course, Labour was also attacked for putting up signs right next to the Green Party headquarters saying Greens could never win, which of course was proven wrong. And but both of those were they felt almost Americanisms. The Reform one, yeah, I mean Reform's already quite a Trumpist party, but the Labour one really sticking it right next to the Green Party headquarters felt rather polarizing and unfriendly in British politics, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I have no particular political allegiance. I suppose I vaguely lean towards the left or the centre left. Although my family were all die-hard socialists, they're all from a mining community when I was growing up. So I saw the consequences of some of the policies of the 80s towards the deunionization of the coal industry. I personally, I think, would welcome a move perhaps more towards a European style of politics, a bit more with, I think we should personally go for some form of PR. I know we had the referendum back in 2012 or whenever it was, but that was, I think, very quietly managed by the Conservative Liberal Alliance at that time and didn't really go anywhere. But I think the politics in the UK has become really fragmented. I don't see necessarily as a bad thing per se. And if it becomes more like the European parliamentary model where you have significant numbers of minority parties that represent certain voices, maybe there's a time in the UK for that, for more plurality in our politics than we currently have enjoyed for the last century or so. It may mean that some agendas slow down, there's more debate on certain issues, there's less chance for autocratic leaders to come in and to power the way through. I mean, it's interesting that Stone Starmer came in with a significant majority. Even in that situation, our system hasn't allowed him to capitalize upon that very well, because MPs have got significant autonomy even within the party political lines, and he struggled to get a lot of his reforms through to the benefit system, to taxation system, because of the voices the MPs are listening to in their own constituencies. So I think we're in a period of flux across many countries in national politics right now. And I do think the green issue has an element of rejection of populist memes and narratives. And I'm not sure that reform will carry the momentum that they might currently have, all the way for the next 3 years, next general election. I don't really see that as being a possibility right now.
Especially with Restore nipping at their toes as well.
Yeah, and even further right-wing party, which have some really interesting and extreme political views.
Mm.
But they've always been those somewhat fringe parties. But it just weakens some of those bases. And the same thing with Corbyn and Zara Sultana's party, I think it is, the Your Party situation, the further kind of left-wing socialist element. It may take some representation in some constituencies and some voice, but it may just be a slightly more of a balanced overall narrative that we see in British politics over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think there's a real appetite for choice, definitely, and I would agree. We definitely need PR to implement that. You can't in a first past the post system. It can be split, but then that's the other issue is it is split, but it's regionally split. So you have almost a fracturization on a state level where you have different regions voting in different parties and they're pushing the country in different directions because of regional wants and needs, and yeah, there's that idea. So yeah, if we continue to see the political choice we do have, PR is absolutely necessary, and if not PR, some more representational system that factors in actual popularity and not regional popularity.
Yeah, there are different models, but I think it would take a party with significant, to be direct, guts to see this through. And I just think it's a shame that when that one chance came and went in 2012, it was relatively low key. It didn't have the publicity, for example, of the Scottish referendum, which was significant media and significant pressure for Scotland not to secede from the Union. And the referendum was almost, maybe deliberately so, didn't get much, I thought anyway at the time, much airtime or much media interest, even though it potentially had much more significant long-term implications for how the Union would be governed in the future.
Yeah, I think the other thing as well is that if we do continue to see like a really split parliament, is what would the party alignments look like? Of course, you could expect Green and your party, or maybe even a Reform Conservative party, although I seem to think Reform would be too proud of themselves to do that. But it's a very real consideration because, of course, Green and Labour by no means want to collaborate right now. Keir Starmer has completely cut off the Greens, and of course the Greens don't want to cooperate with Keir Starmer. And your party and the Greens have voiced support for one another, but as you mentioned, your party is quite fringe right now and doesn't seem to have much popularity. So I think it'd be certainly an interesting thought to think which parties would align with it. I could very much maybe see a Green Lib Dem coalition. Essentially.
Yeah, I mean, a potential driver we're now 10 years post-Brexit or post the Brexit referendum and 6 years post-departure. And you get the sense that there's political cultural shift. Labour are very much finally, perhaps, because I'm getting my cards on the table, I'm very much pro-European, and I always have been. I think there's now more of a willingness to voice changes to be made to our trading relationship, our political relationship with the European continent, the European Union, than there was when Boris Johnson was in power or Rishi Sunak. I mean, those tribulations were awful to watch on TV as Theresa May desperately tried to get the Brexit deal sorted and so on. It was just really, I think it was embarrassing at the time. But now there's more of a willingness. I think people have recognized that with America the way it is, that our allegiances perhaps need to reorientate and recognize our values perhaps more now aligned to European values and American values. So I welcome that shift, and I think if the Liberals and the Greens find a narrative and a unifying voice, that might be something that they find common ground to have a strong message with the electorate going forward.
Yeah, I think that other thing to consider though would be, as I say, the rare chance there is a chance of a Reform government. I don't think there's a chance of a Conservative government, but there is. As I say, I don't think Reform would do it, but potentially if we did see a Reform Conservative government, you would hope that the Conservatives might even take a shift towards the EU to sort of push against reforms, very pro-American policy. I think that would be an interesting shift for Conservatives, because they certainly aren't pro-America, or at least that's my impression, but reforms certainly are. But they do obviously need a political alternative. They can't just say UK needs to go at it alone, because as the events of this week have seen, and the events of the last year have shown, yeah, you need a sort of political bloc to for defence in numbers and the likes.
Yeah, I think the situation has become very much more visible to many people in this country that the UK is certainly has more of a voice within the European Union, and it always did. It was notwithstanding messages coming from the right about this, and with Trump in power for the next 3 years or so, the UK will not have the influence it might have had with Bush in years gone by, Bush and Blair, or pre that Thatcher and Reagan. The world's very different. And I think there's an old idea, an old maxim, there's safety in numbers. And in a world that's getting increasingly unstable, finding partners that give you a bigger voice, a bigger influence economically, militarily, it's just political common sense, I think. And you don't want to be left exposed to the vagaries of the Americans or the Russians and what they intend to do.
I think the biggest issue with a push towards Europe, though, I'm certainly pro-EU and all these other things, would likely be that if we were to rejoin the EU fully, we would have to adopt the euro. And I think that's something even people on the left would probably push against. Maybe even the Greens, for example, would push against adopting the euro, simply because the Greens support MMT economics, which requires the pound to exist and requires a state-owned central bank.
Yeah, I don't necessarily share that point of view. The euro is not universal currency within the EU members. There's different models and tiers of integration. But you're right in the sense of if we did rejoin, we would not have anywhere near the favourable terms we did have, which were coming from Thatcher's negotiating the single European market back in the early 80s. So I think there would be a recognition that we would have to forego what we once had, and that's a penalty we've had to pay by having this dalliance with separation for a period of time. And I personally have no issue with that. I think it would be perhaps a lesson well learned, politically speaking, anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, of course, we could join the European Economic Zone rather than the EU. Then
Yeah, there are different models that could further the relationship and bring us closer to what we once had. And that was always a narrative anyway during the Brexit referendum. If you could look through the archives, and nobody at that time was advocating a complete break from all market structures and systems, even the loosest free trade agreement, and yet we ended up with nothing apart from a few sectors having some form of relationship driven by larger geography, whether it was Gibraltar or something else. So we ended up with the hard Brexit that nobody really wanted or voted for, in my opinion. But there were so many other models that could have been supported and pursued, but weren't at the time.
No, I feel they just wanted to get Brexit over and done with, and they really didn't give it the
expediency, I
needed.
think, and that was the narrative that I think Johnson got elected to, was just get it done, let's have a break, and then see where we are again. I don't think there was much planning or foresight about where that might leave us. And we think we've been paying the price ever since, really.
No, well, of course, I think Switzerland they're in the Schengen area and in the European Economic Zone, but they aren't in the EU. You could very easily imagine almost a parallel situation in the UK, where we do end up as a bit of a Switzerland, where we're not in the EU, but we're in the Economic Zone and in the Schengen area. And as a result, that would give us the economic benefits, and I suppose not the downsides. But I mean, I wouldn't say there were downsides to the EU, in all honesty. Even the right lie that we sent 350 million a week, was it, on that big red bus?
On the famous bus.
I don't know, because that's another thing I'd like to discuss. How did they get away with that lie? How is that allowed to be peddled? Because I imagine there was an element of truth. I was quite young when that whole Brexit issue was happening. So
I recall that there was a headline figure. They did have some statistical justification, and that is debatable. But there was a fee, so to speak, that was paid. And then there was the rebate that Thatcher negotiated. But that whole debate, and there was very little comeback and kickback about this from the Labour and pro-European parties at the time. Nobody sought to quantify the actual financial benefit of membership. So the idea that you're not paying tariffs or quota systems, the value of trading in a free trade environment, and what that is equivalent to per week. And you might, on one hand, pay this, but you get back so much more. So the net benefit is overall positive. So, but it was very clever, and I don't knock Vote Leave or Brexit Party at that point in time for their approach. They were very clever, I think, in choosing their messages very carefully and very powerfully. I just thought at the time that their opponents, the pro-Europeans, didn't have that same level of influence or clout in their messaging. And I go back a lot earlier than this, because I'm a lot older than you are, I think, that the UK government, whatever its left or right wings, post 1973, has to an extent always painted the EEC and then the EU as a bit of a bogey, the bogeyman for what's wrong with the UK. Oh, we have to do it this way because we're told to do it this way, rather than promoting the benefits of membership, as well as the negatives coming with that. So I was in Ireland in '92 as a student. And I remember this was when the Maastricht Treaty was going through approvals to form the European Union. And every household in Ireland got a copy of the treaty, a copy of what it meant, and explanations about what it meant, so that when you voted, you knew what you were voting for. Now, in the UK during Brexit, we did get leaflets from the government about the benefits of membership, but it comparatively was much more muted than I saw in Ireland at the time. And Ireland, at that point in time, they were a relatively poor economic country compared to the rest of the European Union, the EEC at the time, sorry. But now, because of their investment, the farmer inputs and FDI and so on, their GDP per capita is higher than the UK's. And for a long time, it was 2/3 or 3/4 of the UK. So I just think there's a longer narrative there about how the UK governments have historically sought to underplay the benefits of membership because it suited them for political means to have somebody they could blame when things didn't work out or there were consequences or negative political issues that the governments had to promote and deliver in the UK. So I think we need to I think revisit, and Brexit may in the long run help to do that. Revisit and change how we value collaboration with other countries and different levels of cooperation, rather than this kind of autarkic approach and the narrative of we can be alone, we can be independent, but we can also be work with other countries. So I just think that it's a more nuanced argument, but I do, when I go back to my earlier point, the Vote Leave campaign, I think were really, really clever. And they got some very smart people promoting very strong messages that voters listened to back in 2016.
I think, and we are seeing that with the left now. Of course, the Greens have been very, very, very particular about what they talk about, especially with Zach Polansky. Of course, before they were all mostly about environmentalism, and now Polansky is opening the dialogue on wealth tax and all these things. So it's very clear the Greens have taken a page out of that book, and equally so, as you were talking about, sort of re-examining political dialogue and how in the past, of course, we've always used the EU as a scapegoat, and of course, there's the Greens saying hope, not hate. So you would hope, pun intended, that the Greens would potentially focus more on what you were saying about sort of promoting the benefits of current policy, and then creating a more positive dialogue about talking about ways we could improve current policies rather than blaming past policies for current failures. And I get that fills me with hope. But of course, reform And the likes, do you like a good scapegoat with immigrants
Yeah,
and all these other things?
it's a very well-established historical pattern there, and Reform are no different from any other, I think, right-wing party that were populist messaging. Um, but I mean, I've always thought that the way things were, and when Brexit happened, on that morning afterwards, myself and my late wife, we were really heartbroken. We were very much pro-European. I'd even met some young Federalists when I was a student doing my studies in Ireland. Um, sorry, spam call. Um, but I'd always taken the view, I thought that the Brexit might, in the long run, lead to a fundamental reset of the relationship between the UK and the European continent and the countries there, when we might actually, in the long run, see real value in those relationships that perhaps we never really did post Second World War. So I remain perhaps a bit of an optimistic or an idealist in that respect, and I accept that. But Brexit may, in the long run, have done some good in the long political run, anyway.
Yeah, and no, I would agree with that. As I say, with the recent political dialogue we're seeing from the left about so being
Yeah,
more positive about these things. I think we are seeing those benefits, and especially now that we sort of after Brexit we sort of cuddled up next to America instead, and now of course they have Trump in. That is really making us re-examine our diplomatic
uncomfortable,
stances.
uncomfortable truth, I think, as one famous vice president once said.
Mm. I mean, there was also, of course, Kanzuk with Canada, New Zealand, UK, and Australia, and
Yeah.
that was an interesting proposal. I think I saw figures at the time where the economic benefit of that was going to be something in the hundreds of millions, which was compared to Brexit, which was numbered in the trillions in the long run in some instances.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very little, very very little.
I
So,
mean, yeah, there's been no equivalent substitutes that have come anywhere near the loss with the business that have incurred in this country. Um, I just hope that the messages are now coming out, the gradual political and cultural shifts we're seeing, as you mentioned, the political fragmentation we're seeing, but even with the mainstream parties, certainly the Labour, they're being much more bold, I think, than they could have been a couple of years ago in realizing where they can get economic and political benefit from. It's just how they choose to package it for the UK audience at this point. But I think in 2 or 3 years' time, next election, maybe we might see more strong messaging from
mm.
Labour on that issue.
Yeah. I mean, that also depends, of course, on Keir Starmer's survival. A lot of people have, of course, been talking about him being ousted as Prime Minister by the end of the year, or sooner, of course. Or potentially, of course, he continues being Prime Minister, and that would be interesting to see how that pans out, especially, of course, he was. I remember when he was first elected, and I sort of followed what he was doing. I very much saw him as a more diplomatic prime minister than a domestic prime minister. You know, he was going to India and making these trade deals, completing Rishi Sunak's initial trade deal. I believe it was Rishi Sunak who started the India one. But
Yeah.
he sort of went around and did all these trade deals. And of course, that hasn't played out very well because global diplomacy has not played out very well. So, I don't see him surviving as prime minister very long, given, of course, my observation of him as more of a diplomatic than a domestic prime minister in a time when we very much need a domestic prime minister. We don't need, I mean, we need diplomacy, that's undeniable, but we certainly have a lot of issues at home which need addressing rather than trying to wrestle with a bull, I guess you could say, in the
It's
form of Trump.
difficult. I mean, I think Labour Party in a bit of a bind. There's no immediate, as far as I'm aware anyway, person in the wings that could secure both the political party and the wider membership of the party, plus the electorate.
Hmm.
So I think that, right or wrong, I mean, I think some of Starmer's decision making of the last 6, 7 months, I think there could have been a bit more forethought on some of the consequences of what was put in train. I'm thinking of the farmers' tax, inheritance tax for the farmers, the two-child benefit cap, which was then supported, then rescinded. And some of those go to the very heart of some very strong Labour values, Labour constituencies. And it wasn't hard to forecast. There'd be some kickback that the MPs would not accept. I just thought a little bit of naivety, perhaps, as a leader, not realizing the need to manage that more carefully than he did. That said, I think he's done the best he could. And your point about being a diplomat, he's certainly more diplomatic than previous prime ministers have been in
Mm.
dealing with difficult circumstances internationally. I know he's been criticised for the current situation with the Iran war about not allowing Americans and allowing Americans to use some of the UK bases. But I think he's trying to tread a very difficult line there.
I think
Um,
also it comes from his lawyer background, of course, because
yeah,
launching the
yeah,
attack was illegal, but once Iran struck back and hit British bases, then it became legal. So the way I interpreted that was he was just trying to adhere by international law as much as possible, rather than have a
yeah.
diplomatic middle line. Although it did work out as such.
I think Labour are very sensitive on those memories from the Iraq War and the Blair years. They don't want to replicate a situation where they're sucked into something. Oh, sorry, when they are pulled along into something that later on proves to have a very, very questionable foundation, both in law and in just political evidence and narrative. Now, where were the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq all those years ago? And the whole dossier at the time was largely fabrication. So I think Labour are very sensitive, and I think Starmer had little choice but to do what he's doing at this point and just he's caught the ire of Trump, of course he has, but then so has Spain in their recent decision not to get involved in any capacity, including a legal foundation being there isn't one for what America have done according to international law at this point. So it's difficult, but I think Labour just being pragmatic as well. There's no immediate, as far as I'm aware anyway, potential heir that could come through and be crowned. So I think there's a bit of biding their time, seeing how this plays out, and supporting him because they currently have to.
Mm. Well, on of course potential Labour leaders, Andy Burnham was never going to get in because he couldn't stand in the by-election, and there was something to be said that if he did stand, they might have won, but nonetheless. And then of course there's obviously Angela Rayner, the deputy prime minister, but she had
Yeah.
that whole tax scandal, and that's still not subsided legally. So of course I don't imagine she would ever be prime minister. So, yeah, so just sort of listing out the candidates, you can already see and poke holes in even the most prime of candidates. So yeah, I very much see Keir Starmer surviving, simply because there is no other option.
Yeah, I think you're probably right at this point. There's nobody waiting in the wings. I mean, there are some names I could reel off but there's nobody with the visibility of either the two people you mentioned. Um, I think Rayner was, she just took some poor advice, wasn't very clever in questioning some of the advice and just being a bit more common sense about some of the issues about the paid, unpaid tax and the house acquisition and so on. I wasn't surprised Andy Burnham didn't get the nod from the Labour Party to sit the seat. It may have been a threat to Starmer, but I also think that would have potentially opened up a vacuum in Manchester for a Reform candidate to take the mayor position there, which on balance they may think, well, it's a safer bet just keep him where he is
mm,
than not.
yeah, because of course we saw there was the Hull mayoral election and the Lincolnshire mayoral election. I don't think it was ever expected for them to win the Lincolnshire mayoral election, but the Hull mayoral election, Labour very much, I imagine, thought they had a good chance of
Yeah,
winning
yeah.
that, and it was again a reform sweep in Lincolnshire, which was a bit of a surprise, especially given the Conservative legacy. I believe it is.
You thought so with the right wing, the farmers and the landowners here, but it's. I think certainly the farmers have felt the impact of Brexit. I remember seeing all the signs in the farmers supporting were pro-Brexit at that point in time, but the deals post-Brexit and post-cap have not been in their favour. Same with the fishermen.
Mm.
They've not seen the claimed benefit or the claimed representation that they were promised. You know, so
Yeah,
the consequence of that.
on farmers, that's something I wanted to touch on. You mentioned, of course, the inheritance tax, the farm inheritance tax is a bit of a Labour failure. And of course, they didn't actually consult the farmers' union before implementing it. I read recently. And that was sort of they didn't consult the farmers' union for a tax on farms, and I think that says a lot to Labour's failure, that they haven't considered a holistic perspective. They've sort of gone in with a plan and they've got really tunnel visioned onto that plan and not considered the people who it's affecting or any of the stakeholders in general. I think that's another big failure by Labour. You could blame that on Starmer, you could blame it on Labour as a whole being too comfortable with their plan, but it's certainly a failure.
Yeah, you're probably right there, I think. And maybe they were a bit blindsided by the scale of the majority, feeling they could, perhaps they had some right to think that they could push an agenda that would be controversial, knowing that they believed the MPs would support it. But as it proved, they didn't support, and it rumbled on and rumbled on, and eventually they had to move backwards from that. It doesn't mean I don't necessarily think that there's this discussion to be had about whether farmers should or shouldn't have inheritance tax and at what level it's pegged at. I think there should be a discussion about that. I think there is an issue of equity there regarding farmers and non-farmers. But you're right in the sense it would remain common sense. I mean, if you asked any student to do a piece of research or write a paper, they would go, would tell them, have a balanced argument. And without negotiating one of the big unions and seeing what their views are, you haven't got a balanced argument. You've got as you say, a narrow position or a bit of a tunnel view on this. And it was just a bit of naivety. But I can see where it came from. And they may have thought they were 4 years ahead of them, massive majority. We can implement this in some areas challenging manifesto and these policy areas without consequence, and they couldn't.
And I believe it was viewed as a sort of a wealth tax because it was meant to target the likes of Dyson and Clarkson and all of these big farmers who were conglomerating land and were avoiding huge amounts of inheritance tax they should have been paying. But of course, they didn't consult the farmers' union, and I imagine it's because they didn't consult the farmers. They didn't really understand the exact figures they were looking at, and as a result, it hit all the farmers, not just the big Dysons and the monopolists that they were trying to target. Again,
maybe there's a common thread here about just poor political messaging, not just in this issue, but across Brexit, pre-Brexit, post-Brexit. And maybe our parties just aren't very good at speaking to voters in a way their message is clear enough. With exceptions on the Vote Leave campaigns I mentioned earlier, they were very focused and very on point. They found the real pressure point. I just think we've not seen that success post the Brexit referendum in any party's political messaging, really, including Reform. I think Reform, they've got that kind of migrant and immigration question, but whether you agree with it or not, it's one issue, and there are many other issues that warrant discussion. And I just think that they're not very good at either getting off that point onto other issues, politically speaking.
And I'm just conscious of time, and I think you just made a very good holistic conclusion to that episode. So I'd just like to thank you for coming on, and thank you.
No, well, thank you for inviting me. And just for your audience, your win at the UN was impressive, and your role as Donald Trump was also equally impressive. So well done for that.